It was a warm night in late September, and I was in my last year of graduate school. I was living alone for the first time in my life because all of my roommates had already graduated. I had a bachelor apartment in a large building, and my unit was on the second floor. There was a balcony that overlooked one of the parking lots, with a small grassy area right underneath. I had gone to bed early on Sunday night because I had work the next day. After watching some stuff on my laptop for a while, I shut everything down at around 10 p.m. At some point in the night, I woke up to faint screams and what sounded like gunshots. I thought it was some movie that my neighbors were watching because the walls in that building were really thin, and you could even hear light conversations from next door. I didn't know those neighbors well, but I would always hear their TV and sometimes arguing. I got up from my bed, even though I thought it was probably nothing. After a while, though, it sounded too real, so I became concerned. I pressed my ear up to the wall, but it didn't sound like the noises were coming from there. Then I heard one of the hallway doors burst open, and it sounded like somebody was running down the hall outside my apartment. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole, but I didn't see anything. I was pretty sure somebody had run by, though. I could also hear some commotion from above, like people were running around, but the screaming seemed to have stopped. I just couldn't piece together what was happening, but it was concerning. While all of this was happening, I started to get dressed just in case I needed to get out of there. I wasn't sure if it was a fire, but if it was, the alarms would have been going off. That had happened to me before at that place. But there were no alarms. I knew something was happening, though. Then I heard the hallway door open again. This time, there was no running, but I could hear a set of slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward my door from the left. I looked out, but I couldn't see anybody. Yet, the footsteps were still coming, and I knew the person would come into view eventually. As I stood there watching, I heard my neighbor's doorknob turn, then somebody shook it as if trying to open it. This went on for about 10 seconds, and then it stopped. That was when the person came into my sight. It looked like a man, but he had his face covered with what looked like a motorcycle helmet or maybe a paintball helmet. His face was completely covered, and I also noticed that he was carrying a gun. I didn't know if it was real, though. He came right up to my door and stood there for a moment. I stayed quiet, not wanting him to know I was there. I looked down at the deadbolt, and it was locked, as it always was. Then my door handle turned, and the man started pushing it hard. I knew it would hold, the same as my neighbors, but I was still scared that he would break it down. I couldn't help but try to get away from my door because I was scared that he would shoot through it. By that point, I thought we had some kind of intruder in the building, but I still didn't know what he was doing. I managed to tiptoe a few meters away from the door, and the more distance I put between us, the safer I felt. I thought he might have walked away already, but I was not sure. When I made my way to the other side of the room, I almost tripped over my bed, and I was worried that he would hear me. But around that time, I began to hear police sirens in the distance, and I was hoping they were coming for us. Within about 2 minutes, the parking lot outside my building was filled with police cars. It was a relief, but I was still scared of being in that building. I pulled open the sliding door to my balcony and stepped out, wanting to get out of there. The drop to the ground was not that far, so I climbed over the railing and then lowered myself down to the ground. When my feet hit the wet grass, I felt relieved, but the next thing I knew, 3 police officers ordered me down to the ground, and all 3 of them had their guns drawn. I fell to the ground almost instinctively, and I could feel them checking me. I tried to explain what had happened, and eventually, they let me up. One of the cops explained that I should have stayed put. I understand that now, but at the time, I wasn't thinking straight and just wanted to get out of that building safely. I waited out there with the cops for over an hour, and eventually, I heard that the gunman was arrested and taken out. We were not allowed back in the building that night. Since I had no chance of getting any sleep anyway, I decided not to bother getting a hotel or anything. I still went to work the next day because I didn't have anything better to do, but I'd be lying if I said I got anything done. Over the coming days, more information came out about what exactly happened. It turned out that the gunman was one of my neighbors. I didn't know him at all, and when I heard his name, I swear I had never heard of him before. I was shown a picture of him by the police, and I had probably seen him around the building once or twice, but that was it. I found out that he fired 2 shots into one of the apartments upstairs, which must have been the noise that woke me up. Luckily, nobody was hurt. I was told that he went up to the door and shot right through it, a scenario that sounded eerily similar to what almost happened to me. I still think that the only reason he didn't shoot was that I was quiet enough that he didn't think I was there. Looking back, it seems like a miracle that nobody was hurt. With a crazy cycle like that going around, anything could have happened to me or anybody else. I live with my parents in a rural area. We're about 20 minutes outside of a small city, and our house is on a dirt road just off one of the main country highways in the area. We had lived there for only 2 years when this happened, and I was going into the 10th grade. I did 8th grade in our new town, then moved on to high school. Even though the transition was tough, I had made one really good friend, Brady, who lived in our town. I would go to his place sometimes, and sometimes he would come out to our property. Our house was on a 2-acre lot, and the neighbors in either direction were far away. Farther down the street was an older guy who kept to himself and seemed nice whenever we saw him. In the other direction, closer to the highway, was an older woman whose son was still living with her. His name was Nelson, and he was probably in his 50s. I don't know what, if anything, he did for work or if he was just taking care of his mother. One day in the summer, Brady came over. It was about 2 weeks before school started, so I guess it was August. We were just hanging out in my backyard because it was a nice day. But at around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, we got bored and decided to go for a walk on some of the dirt roads. The area was pretty nice, with some farm fields, but also a lot of trees. You could sometimes see deer or other animals. We would see coyotes, groundhogs, or even skunks. As we set off, we knew there were still at least a few hours of light left. The sun was low, but still strong. We were walking with the sun at our backs, and long shadows stretched out in front of us. That's when I looked back and saw a car coming up toward us from behind. I knew right away that it was Nelson's car, because there were only a few people who would drive around there. It was an old red car, but it was updated with tinted windows, and had a white racing stripe down the center. As it approached from a distance, I could see it swerving wildly all over the road. My friend and I froze for a second, then I jumped down off the road into the ditch. Brady followed me. We didn't know what was going on with him, but it was better to get out of the way just in case. When he got close to where we were, the car swerved off the road into the ditch where we were hiding. It barreled toward us, almost flipping over as it raced through the narrow space. He was coming right at us, and we were both terrified that we'd be run over. We scurried into the cornfield just in time to avoid being hit. We then watched as the car made it back up onto the road, hoping that would be the end of it. Brady and I came out and went back up to the road. We were both shaken as we stood there watching the car swerve away, but then it seemed to stop. We were both shocked as it began to reverse toward us. While it was still at a distance, we ran back off the road and into our hiding spot in the field. The car pulled right up to where we were standing on the road, and the door opened. Nelson got out. We were hiding among the stalks of corn, looking through. Not much happened after that. We just saw him standing there for about 30 seconds, then he got back into his car and drove away. We were beyond freaked out because we almost died. Then, when he came back, I thought he was going to do something to us. My next thought, and it was clear when we saw him standing there, was that Nelson was definitely drunk. I poked my head out of the field and saw that the road was clear. When it looked safe, Brady and I came out and went back to my house. We cut through one of the fields on our way back to avoid being on the road because we didn't want to run into Nelson again. When we got back, my dad was at the front of the house doing some yard work. I went up to him and told him everything that happened to us. He had a calm response, and he just told us to go into the backyard. What happened next is just what my dad told me, because I wasn't there. He went over to talk to our neighbors, because that's how people handle things in my area. Most people don't call the cops unless they've at least tried to figure things out for themselves. When he got to the house, he could see Nelson's car parked diagonally on their driveway with one of the back tires in the front garden. When he knocked on the door, Nelson answered. My dad could instantly tell that he had been drinking. Even though he knew there was no sense in trying to reason with him, my dad couldn't help but lay into him. According to my dad, he yelled at him for a good few minutes while Nelson tried to deny the whole thing. He said he was driving by and saw us jump off the road into the field for no reason. Then he backed up to try to help us. He completely denied running us off the road and said that his car was never even in the ditch. When my dad came back, he called the cops to report the incident. The police went to talk to Nelson, but when they talked to him, he denied that he was even driving that day at all. Therefore, the cops couldn't do anything because he wasn't caught driving drunk. From that day on, things were tense in our neighborhood. My parents wouldn't let me go out by myself for a few months afterward, and I was never allowed to go near Nelson's house. We saw him around now and then one night, I was out with friends. I was getting a ride home. One of my friends was driving, and as we passed Nelson's house, we could see his car stopped on the road in front. The lights were on. As we passed, I made eye contact with him, and it was pretty creepy. When I got out of the car, I ran in and locked the door. That was pretty much the last thing to happen with him. We still live there, and I'm worried that he'll do something else. This happened when I was in the 8th grade, and back then, I lived with my mom, dad, and brother. My brother, Lenny, was 2 grades below me, so I guess he was in the 6th grade. We lived in this suburb on the edge of the city, which felt more like the countryside than a suburban neighborhood. It wasn't flashy or upscale, but it was comfortable with spacious yards between decent-sized houses. My mom worked full-time, and she didn't get home until a few hours after my brother and I would be back from school. Our dad traveled a lot for work, and he was gone close to half the time. He was away on a work trip when this happened. There was also this one neighbor, Scott, who lived a few doors down from us. He was in his 50s, single, and had become somewhat of an unofficial handyman around the block. Scott would occasionally help out with our yard work and do minor repairs around the house, especially when our dad was away. He seemed alright, a bit quiet, but always friendly when we saw him. One afternoon, just like any other, Lenny and I were home alone, sitting in our living room, flipping through TV channels. We were sitting on the couch, arguing about what to watch. Me being the older brother, I had the remote, and he wasn't big enough to take it away from me, so it was really my choice. I settled on a rerun of King of the Hill, which we were both okay with. Then we saw somebody walking up to the house. The front window was right next to the couch where we were sitting, and the path to the front door went right past it. Before I knew it, there was a knock on the front door. I looked out, and it was Scott, our neighbor. Since I knew him, I unlocked it and opened it a crack. I was really just planning on telling him that our parents weren't there and that he should come back later. I thought that my mom had probably owed him some money for some work or something. Before I could do much of anything, Scott pushed the door all the way open and then went past me. He walked right into the living room, and then I followed him. He had not said a single word to me, and it was not like him to just barge in like that. Lenny was still on the couch looking confused and a bit scared. As Scott approached, he grabbed Lenny by the arm and started pulling him towards the door. It was surreal watching this man, who I thought was a harmless neighbor, now dragging my little brother out of our house. I yelled for Lenny to stay or break free, but Scott was way too strong, and Lenny didn't have a chance. I'm sure he was also too shocked to resist much. Scott was dragging him to the front door while I screamed and tried to help. I grabbed the back of his shirt, trying to pull him back. Then I tried kicking Scott, but it didn't seem to have any effect at all. He was a big guy, and even the two of us together were no match for him. They were almost out the front door when I ran out to the yard. It was still light out there, and there were some people out. I managed to scream loud enough to catch the attention of another neighbor. He was mowing his lawn across the street. When we got his attention, he turned off the mower and looked towards us with concern as he approached. Scott suddenly stopped and let Lenny go. Then Lenny ran behind me. When the other neighbor came over, Scott began trying to smooth things over, offering some explanation. He said he was trying to help and pretended to be confused about why Lenny was screaming. The other neighbor looked between us, trying to make sense of the scene. Scott's attempt at an excuse seemed to satisfy him, though I could tell he was still a bit puzzled. Scott took off and headed back to his house as our neighbor returned to his yard work, leaving us standing there in our driveway, trying to understand what had just happened. We were both kids, so we were confused. At that age, it seems like adults know better, so we weren't even completely sure if he had done something wrong. Crazy as that sounds, Lenny and I went back inside, locking the door behind us. We sat down on the couch, not really watching TV anymore, just sitting in silence until our mom got home. Scott made up some story about thinking Lenny was in danger from a snake that he had seen in our yard, a flimsy excuse that didn't hold up but somehow got him off the hook. We do have poisonous snakes in our area, but we were inside the house at the time. He denied coming into the house at all, and since our other neighbor didn't see him go in, the cops couldn't do anything. That's how it had to be, based on his word against ours, especially since Lenny hadn't been hurt. Our mom believed us, though, and that was enough to confirm that we weren't overreacting. We became more cautious and stayed away from Scott from then on. He kept his distance after that as well, but we were always scared that he would do something else whenever we saw him around.